Good evening, everyone. It's Kim from the Pennington Public Library. Thank you for joining us for a conversation this evening with director Judith Ehrlich about her work on the documentary The Boys Who Said No, Draft Resistance and the Vietnam War. We are also lucky to have resistor and featured guest Bob Eaton join us as well this evening. This program, for those of you who don't know, is part of our 2022 NEA Big Read Initiative, which seeks to bring our community together around one book and to use this shared experience to explore the many themes of the book. Our particular book choice is the graphic novel memoir, The Best We Could Do, which takes an intimate look at one family's journey from their war-torn home in Vietnam to their new lives in America. And NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. Before we start, if you have any questions during the program, please write them in the Q&A section, and we'll be addressing a select number of questions as they relate to the conversation. Thank you. A little bit about our filmmaker. Judith Ehrlich is an Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker who co-produced and co-directed The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, which was nominated for an Academy Award and Primetime Emmy in 2009. Judith also co-produced and directed The Good War and Those Who Refuse to Fight It. She's the only filmmaker to twice win the top US awards for history film, the John O'Connor Film History Award from the American Historical Association and the Eric Barnow Award from the Organization of American Historians. Welcome, Judith. And Judith, I believe you would like to introduce Bob.
Yes, Bob Eaton is one of the most impressive people in the film, I think. And he's in Maine. I'm in Australia right now. Bob's in Maine. And I hope my signal works because we've had a lot of storms and my internet went out. But anyway, I'm here with you now. Bob's here with you from Maine. And he has had, I was thinking, Bob's been in Vietnam. He sailed a boat into Hanoi from that was illegal at the time. You might want to talk about that, Bob. But I haven't been in Vietnam. I'm hoping to go with this film at one point. But I think the film really tries to show the leadership of the movement and also just how widespread it was and how so many ordinary guys were willing to risk 5 years in prison to follow their conscience. So that I think that, and given that this war in Ukraine is going on right now, and there's a lot of resistors starting to emerge in Russia and in Russia primarily, and refusing to fight on the Russian side. I think that this is particularly relevant right now.
Thank you so much, Judith. I think this documentary gives a very unique voice to that time period. And I'm curious, I'm going to start off by asking you, Judith, about your journey and how you became involved in directing this documentary. Where did it start with you, for you?
Well, you know, I've been on this subject for about 30 years, maybe 40, I lose count. I started out doing, the first thing I ever did was something that was aimed at stopping young people from joining the military. It was called Choice or Chance, Draft Registration and Recruitment. And then I ended up, which was used, I think probably, Bob, you may have used it. I know the Quakers used it a lot for doing outreach for students. And then I did The Good War and Those Who Refuse to Fight It. Also did a three-part series for the National Public Radio on the history of conscientious objection. And then I did The Most Dangerous Man. But I think I became, Christopher Colorado Jones, who was a resistor himself, organized this reunion at David Harris's house, and 70 resistors came. And he just asked me to come and interview them. So, and it went on for 2 days, and the second day at Fort Mason Center. So I came and I started doing these interviews, and I thought, oh my gosh, I don't want this just ending up in the drawers of the people who are at this reunion, which is what Christopher had in mind. It's just like a memento more. And I ended up deciding it really deserved a feature film. And Christopher happened to be a fundraiser. So he actually raised the entire budget for this film, which was hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then very tragically fell off the ladder and died right at when the film was almost complete. So he never got to see it in the proper screening. He did see the film pretty much finished. So Yeah, this is different. He actually hired me to do it, which is very unusual. Usually I raise all the money and I'm usually producer and director, but Christopher was the producer.
Oh, it's tragic to hear about him.
Yeah.
When you interviewed the people initially, is that the footage you used for the film?
Some of
How
it.
was the
No,
process?
Bob, I went to Maine. I was staying with my stepdaughter not too far from where Bob lives in Maine. So I was able to go out in the boat with him for the day. We had a lovely day there and did the interview with him. And I picked up a incredible cameraman and works for National Geographic who happens to live down the road from Bob. So, and I think the Randy Keeler one, somebody else did for me back east. And there were a few in the East Coast I didn't do, but the other ones either I did that day or followed up with them later. But the rest of them I did.
Bob, could you provide some of the memories you have of filming The Boys Who Said No and your first meeting with Judith?
Well, it was very, very simple, actually. Judith came to our house and she must have taped for a couple hours, and
Yeah.
I was just in a pretty good mood, I think. When I look at it now, I said, boy, I was in a very happy place, and that was nice. Her questions were great. And then later we went off and actually shot some footage on the boat that my family built, which was nice. It didn't make the film, but anyway, it was a very nice experience. It's just lovely. And I was a big fan of hers because of The Most Dangerous Man. So anyway, I was predisposed to fall in love with Judith, and I did. So there you have it.
Mutual. I mean, the thing about, I personally would never want to spend one day in jail, but I love making films about people who are willing to do that and make the sacrifice that they did. It's not my thing at all. So I just like to be the documenter of these people of extraordinary courage. And Bob has throughout his life been a very courageous peacemaker and working to end landmines in Laos and Cambodia. Was it just Laos? Both.
Well, actually all over the world, finally.
Yeah. So he was a leader in that movement and has really spent his life doing anti-war work, and his wife as well. So it's been an honor to really be with all these people, and David Harris and Joan Baez has been a big supporter of the film and really been wonderful to work with her as well and tell that story. So
Now, Bob, are you familiar with all of the people from the film? Did you meet new people through this filming process?
Oh, many of them I knew from the old days, and some were new, and that was such a pleasure to see the breadth of people involved in this. And I think I've watched, people. I sort of had the feeling, people make films. They shoot 100 out of the film. They get rid of everything but two, and they put it all together. It's done. And to watch this film evolve from the first version to the second, to the third, to the fourth, to the fifth, it's and the last one's the best of the lot. Thank goodness. It got better and better, but it bears almost no resemblance to the first version. And to watch that process of discussion and so on was just fascinating to me. But my whole participation in this film was a lovely day with Judith and that cameraman in my home. And then I just sat back and watched. I was an observer.
But you brought up a good point, Bob, because this film was like all films made by a village. But this was really, there was a committee of 5 members who were Lee Swenson and Steve Ladd and Barbara Meyer and Christopher and Bill Prince. And they were with me the whole time and fact checking and Bob Cooney, who's a historian and really just amazing guy. and so they just, I really made this film with them all the way through. We'd meet once a month and have a 3-hour session. And in between, they just, had so many ideas. And one of the things I'm most proud about, I don't think anyone had ever put the civil rights movement together with the anti-war movement.
That's right.
And that was really came from the committee, and they kept
Mhm.
pushing me, and I kept going, I don't know, is there really anything to that? I was not on that to begin with. And after they kept nudging me, I started exploring it more and thought, this is really a unique part of this story, that actually it was this movement was built on the back of the civil rights movement, as the movements of today are built on the earlier movements. And I think that what I hope this film is useful for is to really it's been called a blueprint for resistance. I hope it functions in that way. It just feels like we tried to really give it the breadth of how a movement builds, and the strategy it takes to actually make it successful, and to really make progress and change policy by a bunch of very smart young men in this case, and women who were also very active in this movement. And so I hope we captured that, and that it's useful to others.
Yeah.
I'm getting a lot of feedback, from environmentalists who are using it to organize. Sorry, Bob.
I think Judith is being very generous. That committee of people, I know all, but I think one, are all great people. They're wonderful people. But I would no more want to come to them with a vision and say, okay, now you're the committee, let's make it work. I mean, the idea of a professional artist trying to deal with a lay committee is, I'm glad I wasn't a fly on the wall on all of it.
Listen,
but the wonderful thing is it worked. It worked at the end.
It did. No, listen, I really thought, I am not making a film with a committee. Are you kidding? I did that with the very first thing for John Dellen's office, and 12 organizations jumped on board and wanted to work with me. It was a nightmare from the day we started till the day we finished. But this was not. I mean, this committee, they were all such unique and wonderful humans that it worked great. Christopher. I mean, everyone had a very unique role in it, but it was, it was pretty fabulous, actually. And I kept thinking, pinch myself, this is going to go off the rails any minute, right? But it didn't. It really, they were great to work with. They were very, I'm being sincere when I say they really helped a lot.
Good.
No, it's also, you get kind of myopic when you're making a film, and you think about it all day and all night. And right now unfortunately, I'm making a podcast with Daniel Ellsberg about trying to, it's called Diffuse Nuclear War, just the subject I want to think about all day and night, right? So I'm, immersed in that, and I'm going, why can't I make films about puppies and Santa Claus? Like, I'm in this women's film group. My friend makes a fortune. She makes Santa Claus and puppies and dog pounds, and and then NBC picks it up and makes a series of 10 of them, and it's like, and I keep ending up with war and disaster anyway. But hopefully they're useful.
So, Judith, you mentioned incorporating the Civil Rights movement into the whole war framework. Were there any other surprises, I guess, in your process?
That's a good question. I think the surprises were more because I've got my archival shirt on, Kim, just for you. I just was like, you can't really see it. It's all archival.
Oh, I love it.
Newspapers, yeah. I wear this shirt, my archival. Anyway, I really love making historical films, and I love searching archives. And I had a really good archivist working full-time for me for a year finding this, and then my editor turned out to be great at finding material, so we would just sit all day and find these little niches that we had missed. But David and Joan were really well documented. There were several independent films made on them, so I had all that wonderful footage of them and their relationship, and then also the LA resistance had 2 films made about them. So I had quite a lot of footage of this actual movement, and of course, plenty of archival of the war and the television coverage at the time and all that I knew I would have, but there's an enormous amount. When I made the film, The Good War and Those Who Refused to Fight It, it was about Quakers and Mennonites and Brethren for the most part, there were also some resistors who went to prison, but most of them were conscientious objectors. And these are people who don't take pictures of their own weddings. I mean, the documentation was extremely slim, and mainstream media certainly didn't document these people who chose to go to prison or camp. So I mean, we really had to dig to find anything about those guys. So this was like, oh my God, there's too much footage. And, you know, we had to sort of sort through enormous amounts of it. But I think that surprises were finding things that we didn't expect to find. That we really had the guys in LA coming off the bus, you know, and people handing them flowers, and you know, that sort of thing that was such a lovely idea, but we didn't in a million years think we'd actually be able to document it, to illustrate that with footage. So there were a lot of things like that we found along the way. Plus my college boyfriend, I found him being dragged down the stairs by a cop in San Francisco. Moments like that, which were kind of surprising and interesting.
Bob, what was it like for you seeing the film? You said that it's gone through many transitions and you were pleasantly surprised, but you're looking at a part of your life and your history. What was it like for you and your journey just to see it on the big screen?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because to see what Judith put on the screen in terms of my interview, and then watching my words from the other side of the screen was a little bizarre. And then to see it put in, but it was lovely though, to see it put, because to see it put in the context of this fabric she wove with the warp and the wolfwood oil, to see it put in a larger context was a real thrill, because I said, hey, I was really a part of something important, wasn't I? And I know, and I have to say, I personally wouldn't change a moment of what I did in terms of the draft resistance movement, and I worked very hard on it in Philadelphia. But frankly, before this movie, I never really understood the historical context. I mean, I learned so much from this movie. I just thought, look, this was a rather quixotic moral witness who was terribly important to put on the record. One, to do it because it was moral, and also to put it on the record. Some said no, but that it was a footnote. And then I realized watching this film, no, it wasn't a footnote. And so I just felt invigorated. I just, whoa, this is terrific.
That's great. Well, you know, Ken Burns did, I don't know how many, I actually couldn't quite watch them, but the 12 hours, I think, of the history of Vietnam, he does not mention this movement at all, or that there were resistors who went to prison. It's not in there. So, I mean, I think it is very much considered a footnote by the mainstream record, historical record. And that's why we really wanted to make the film, was to correct the record, because, you know, this really was a vanguard of the anti-war movement, and very much, you know, it was a small movement compared to the millions who went out and spent, you know, a Sunday afternoon with a sign. But it's really the courage of these people really inspired the bigger movement. Very
and the other thing is to realize too that this movie sort of documents the place in history that we were, and it's really important to know your story as part of a larger story, and that there is a history, and that we are following in the footsteps of so many. And a little off the subject, I just have to just draw attention to John Cordy, who died, a great filmmaker who worked for the Quakers when he was very young. And one of his first jobs as a filmmaker was with the Quakers. But a great filmmaker who did wonderful things, Language of Faces and so on, back in the 60s. And we've all built, cinematography is built on what he did. His famous one was Diary of Miss Jane Pittman. But anyway, that's off the subject. I'm sorry.
You mentioned that. No, I just, about 2 years ago, or well, I've been in Australia for 2 years, but no, about maybe 4 years ago, I was out in Point Reyes Station, which is where John lives. And someone had told me he lives out there. And I had his phone number and I just called him up for no good reason, except I admired him so much. And I said, you know, I'm in town and could we have coffee or whatever? He came over and gave me all of his films on DVD, this huge stack of DVDs, and took me out to coffee and was so kind and wonderful. And I was thinking, like about a week ago, oh, when I go home in a few weeks, I really want to look up John Cordy again. And then I read his obituary, and there was a lot of talk in the film community about him. But what a lovely man he was, as well as a great filmmaker. So yeah, sorry.
And well, and Judith, you stood on his shoulders, and others will stand on your shoulders. The circle is unbroken. It's one of our favorite songs. One of our favorite songs in the Resistance is "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" And it's not broken.
It's true. I mean, you know, the thing that interests me is we've been trying to organize community screenings, and before we even went to the Bullfrog Films is our educational distributor now. If people want to have a screening of their own, they can contact Bullfrog and arrange that. But we had 100 people sign up, or organizations sign up to do community screenings, and a lot of them were Extinction Rebellion, you know, young radical environmental protectors, and it's really interesting that they saw in this film a way to be more effective as organizers. So I really think that's exactly what I was hoping would come of it.
I have a little bone to pick with you, Judith, about your editing. I made a suggestion towards the end that it ought to end with Joan singing this wonderful song of hers, "Carry It On," and showing pictures of the environmental movement and the women's movement and the gay liberation movement and so on, because that's the way. But anyway, you rejected my idea.
How it ended. Oh, not that song. We did end it.
Not that song.
We had that song composed for the film. So that would have been good too.
You're forgiven. You're forgiven.
Yes. But no, you just reminded me of something. I sent you this clip, Kim, of early when we were starting the film. We did all these short clips of like characters in the film, Joan and David and Bob and I think Randy. Anyway, and the one I sent to you of Bob, I was watching. I hadn't watched it in so long. I didn't even know I still could find it. It's on the website actually for people who want to know more about Bob, and it's. But I was reminded, I thought, oh, how come that didn't make it into the film? How come that didn't? And you think, you know, there's so many, you make thousands, tens of thousands of decisions when you're looking at what I had, I think 150 hours of footage, for this hour and a half. And now I have to cut it back to an hour for broadcast.
Oh, no.
I'm letting somebody else do it. I can't do it. So it's like, I can only, it's too painful. But
it's your baby.
Yeah, my baby. It's just like, just the way the film is exactly where I wanted it to be when we finished. We spent over a year and a half editing this film. I mean, it's really been picked over very carefully and, you know, seen by many people along the way. But I missed all those things that you said, so many amazing things. And I thought, oh, we could just put all of the brilliant things that everybody said in this film. But I did want to note that Todd Friend, who I think is one of the most wonderful characters.
Oh.
He died like a year after the film was done. He ran owned Tamales Bay Oyster Company, and he fell off a boat in the bay, which was hard to imagine. He was the most amazing, the best guy at a wheel of a boat I've ever been with, besides you maybe, but a small boat. And so anyway, we lost him too, which was really a shame but his daughter's been very helpful.
Todd carried that film. Todd was the backbone to the whole film. He was magnificent. And I never met him. And I saw that film and I said, I'm going to meet this guy. And then I learned of his death. I just can't believe it.
Well, I had a very hard time convincing him to do that. It took us going out to Point Reyes a number of times because he just didn't want to do it. You know, he's very private guy. And, you know, he spent a long time in prison. And he just did not want to do it. And he ended up being so good, and it was just, you know, sort of a surprise to him, I think, as well as to
perfect.
Us.
He was perfect.
Well, everybody, David, you know, there's so many good characters, and I was thinking, well, Mark Rudd really surprised me that he would, you know,
I was- Yes, I know. I was going to ask that question because
Yeah.
the documentary, the trajectory of everything, like you said, including the civil rights movement, and then including this trajectory of, people who became violent, who became so passionate. I thought that was so interesting. And then the choice of having Mark Rudd, but then to have David Harris interview him. I thought that was an interesting choice. Could you elaborate on that and how that came about?
I'm trying to remember. I think it was just, well, Mark was coming to town because he lives in New Mexico or Arizona, I think New Mexico. And he was coming to town and we had gotten wind of that. And I said, well, why don't you two just have a conversation about it? And so we got 2 cameras and we set them up having this conversation. And it got pretty heated. Because David isn't one to just go, oh, okay, I respect your opinion. I mean, he was not going to back down. And Mark was already on his side, but David wasn't too excited about that. So it was really a lively conversation. And then Mark said, such amazing things about the power of nonviolence for somebody who had been planting bombs and doing the things he was doing as part of the Weather Underground. And I believe he's the only one of that group public, the well-known people who have recanted. I mean, the rest of them are still take the position they did the right thing. So it was interesting to see how strong he was in, feeling like he hadn't done the right thing. Yeah. And they're good people.
I was going to ask you too, and this is maybe a difficult question, but how has the movie been received by the public in general? You're talking about this is not mainstream,
right?
And I know for the library, for the first time, we've received sort of interesting mixed reactions to announcing this. And for myself and Judith, and I think a number of people here in the audience know that my parents were Vietnamese refugees. So I was born after the war, and so I've been spending a lot of time piecing together parts of history, just trying to understand everything and just trying to keep an open mind. And you mentioned, the conversation with David Harris and Mark Rudd, like the heated nature of it and just the heated time period. I mean, how has the reception to this film been, you found?
It's been shockingly good. I mean, we sort of started out slow. We made a strategic mistake at the beginning, and I got pushed into releasing the submitting to film festivals with a rough cut, which you should never do. Anyway, so we sort of got rejected by all the big film festivals at the beginning. And then we finished it and we released it again and we started winning awards at every festival we went to. And it was like we won the Supreme Award at the Melbourne Documentary Festival, which is a very good one here in Australia. And it played at almost every festival in Australia and won awards at most of them. And then it started winning awards in the US. And it really, I was surprised it did so well. It seemed like I didn't know. When we finished The Most Dangerous Man, I knew we had a film that was going to do well, and it did very well. Yeah. This one, I kind of went, it's kind of niche, maybe. What's the political atmosphere in the US is so difficult to figure out. I mean, it's just like, is this going to be okay? Well, I can't get a broadcast for it. I mean, PBS originally said yes, and then they backed down. And so I'm now looking at MSNBC, and I've got somebody helping me sell it to broadcast. And, but that was disappointing because I thought I was going to get an independent lens right off the bat. And she pretty much said she was going to broadcast it, and then she changed her mind. So we're now going to sell it in Europe, and we're going to streamers, and I've got a team of salespeople working on it to start it. And I think they're going to get it out much further than I could, because I hate doing that, and they seem to like it, so that's good. I was thinking about with the Vietnam. Did I answer that question? Yeah, I think it's done really well, and Bullfrog's thrilled to have it, and they're doing a very good job putting it out. And I think they have a mailing list of like 100 and 200,000 teachers around the country who buy the films for libraries and hospitals. I was going to say no, schools, college, and libraries. So that's I think it'll get out widely that way. But getting back to Vietnam, Bob, maybe you could talk a little bit about your experience of going to Vietnam during the war, and which was not something that the United States government was particularly happy with.
Well, briefly, to sort of gloss over a lot, I was part of a Quaker group that historically Quakers have always, because we're pacifists, but we've said we were not going to avoid war. We're just not going to fight in it and add to the violence, and we'll try to relieve the suffering. So in almost any war, starting in fact at the Crimean War a long time ago, not the recent one, over 100 years ago, Quakers have always showed up to at least try to help the victims. And so we started sending medical aid to both North and South Vietnam, to civilian hospitals. And the US government wouldn't let us send this stuff to the North. And so we finally got a boat and sailed it into Haiphong in the middle of the war with medical supplies. And we took the supplies directly to the hospital so we could monitor them. And it was an experience to be in North Vietnam. Hanoi was being bombed, and the U.S. said it wasn't. And I thought, this is ironic. I'm in a bomb shelter, and I can hear it all around me. And the U.S. said, no, we're not bombing. But, and by the way, an interesting fact, and the film documents this, very few draft resistors actually ended up in prison. Of the tens and 100,000 draft resistors, a handful ended up in prison actually. And in the Philadelphia area, I know of, during my sort of in a 5-year period, 3 draft resistors went to prison. One was a guy who had no political background. I asked him, I was in prison with him. I said, George, why are you in prison? You're not political. He said, I just got there, and that guy told me to stand forward and raise my hand to be inducted into the Army. I said, that isn't right. And I walked out. So boom. The other was another crew member of the boat, the Phoenix, that had taken aid to North Vietnam. So I always felt that we were selected out, John and I, as 2 Quakers that had taken aid to Vietnam during the war. The government sort of felt like it got a twofer with us. And by the way, the horror of that war, and North and South, the bombing is an unspeakable horror. It was a war crime. It doesn't matter whatever you thought about the war itself politically, the execution of that war was a war crime. And the suffering of the Vietnamese people, North and South, pro-Saigon, anti-Saigon, didn't matter what side you were on, the suffering was incalculable. And to this day, I'm astounded at the generosity of spirit of the Vietnamese people towards the United States and what we did to them. Sorry, that was a bit of a lecture.
No, it was beautiful. I know. And you were there at a time when it was, and then Joan Baez went to visit North Vietnam and ended up in a bomb shelter. And I think they didn't admit to that either, but she was directly bombed and pretty terrified, and was,
she was a better bomb shelter person to be in a bomb, because she sang to the people in the bomb shelter. I couldn't sing, so.
You should have sung to the people. Well, there are a lot of people in bomb shelters again now. So, I mean, that's the thing is that about war is we've had a pretty quiet period, relatively, unless you happen to be in Syria or, or Afghanistan. But it feels like people have become more conscious of the horrors of war, and also about the possibility of nuclear war, which has been way off the radar for a long time. So, I think we're at a period now where this film fills a kind of gap of what happens when there's war. Can you do anything about it personally? Or, is there something, can you stand up against war and make a difference? And I think this film tells that story really well, of people who have the courage to do that. And got organized. And so much of it's really about the nitty-gritty aspects of organization. That it's okay to think, oh, I want to stop global warming, or climate change, but but unless you really get an organization that can do that, and because of a lot of blood, sweat, and tears by a lot of people, it's not going to go anywhere. So I'm encouraged in a lot of ways by the amount of organizing there is around those two the major issues we face, which I think are environmental and violence and war, and we seem like there's a lot of people organized to stop it.
But having said, the fact that you're working on the nuclear question in terms of your film right now is really important. Dan sent me his latest book about 5 years ago. I can't remember. And frankly, I didn't read it. And then we started exchanging email about it 3 years ago. And he said, Bob, did you read my book? And I wrote back, I'm working on it. And I rushed to my library and found it and read it. And I was horrified. I was horrified because we've been sleepwalking through a sort of feeling. That was then. We're past that. We're not past it. We're not past the calculated threat that it could unleash its fury on all of us, nuclear weapons.
The book, by the way, is called The Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And I had it on he gave me an early gallery, and then he gave me, I had a digital version of it, and then he gave me the book, and I sat on my shelf for 3 years, and I was afraid to read it. And then this came up, or it was a little before this, and I finally went, okay, bite the bullet, read the book. You may have some nightmares, but it's really a fabulous read. And just our assumptions about how nuclear war is controlled, and the number of people who have their fingers on the buttons around the world. Every commander of every submarine fleet could start a nuclear war, along with a whole lot of other people. So the whole thing with the football is totally not happening. So, and Dan's a very good writer, and his two sons are both great editors. So it's a great read, actually. If you have the nerve to sit down and actually read it, it's well worth the effort.
I'd credit in the last 3 years, the two most important books I read were Dan's Doomsday and Dark Money.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a whole nother story. But anyway, Dan's book is critical. People should read it. And hopefully your documentary is going to kind of give cinematic sort of shape to that whole thing.
We're doing something very different with this. I'm working with Norman Solomon from Roots Action, who's an incredible organizer. And we're starting out with these 5-minute podcasts that are going to be linked together. I'm going to do 10 of those, so you can just listen to one. And then I've got the graphics guy who's now putting a visual track on it, so it'll be on. It's for online. It's not for broadcast or for. It's going to be maybe audio and then small pieces that'll be posted online on the with Roots Action. So yeah, I'm excited. I was first because I was a radio producer for 10 years before I. Rick Tejada Flores talked me into doing this film. Or no, maybe I talked him into doing the film with me. I can't remember anyway. So we did The Good War together, and he used to say, "Judy, you just make radio shows and slap pictures on them. You don't really care about the visual part." And I thought, I love making a strong soundtrack that's got the content there, and then the visuals are that's gravy in my mind. And so I'm happy to go back to radio, which is much easier, much simpler, much cheaper than making film. So this will be my retirement, is podcasting.
That sounds wonderful. Podcasting. I do like podcasts a lot. We have some questions from our audience.
Yeah.
So let me ask. The first question is from Holly. She asked us a while back. Did David Susskind ever recant or apologize to Muhammad Ali? I assume he knew his legacy was permanently damaged.
I don't know if either of those things are true. I don't think that he did recant, and I don't think he probably cared. But I think he had such an enormous ego that he probably thought, well, I was probably right. I am totally talking out of the holes in my head, as my mother would say. But he really, I don't think he recanted. And I can't imagine he would have recanted, because he was pretty sure of himself. I think he probably stood by his position. Do you know, Bob, anything about that?
No.
No, I never heard
Yeah.
anything about that,
Yeah.
or assume he wouldn't have, but just my assumption.
Yes. And then we have a question from Kathleen. As someone who's attended many protests these past few years, I really love this movie. I'm grateful that unlike your subjects, I haven't once feared being jailed. But my question is another angle. What size budget would you hope to have when you set out to create a documentary like this one?
It's very expensive. It was the Most Dangerous Man's budget was $1 million in the end. This one we brought in at 750, I think, by the time we were done. But then the Most Dangerous Man also had some things beyond the broadcast, beyond just the film itself. But yeah, it's a lot of money. And Christopher, thank heavens for Christopher. I mean, he really was a professional fundraiser. He just kept at it and raised an incredible amount of money from, he had run a foundation called Agape, which was a peace foundation in San Francisco. And he just knew where the bones were buried. He knew where the requests were going to come from. And he did a really good job. So that's, it's a big budget. Usually in the past, my other two films for broadcast were both funded by ITBS, which is a $325,000 to $50,000 budget to begin with. So you've got, enough to limp along. And then when you get that, then you can raise other money on the back of having enough to. But I think this 750,000. So I'm seeing people saying $1.5 million in Europe. They're spending on hour and a half or even hour films, and some even more. So I'm sure Ken Burns' budget was in the tens of millions for that series.
That was crazy.
General Motors, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So
you mentioned how difficult it was to edit down the footage. Have you ever thought of using the shelved footage, or what are your thoughts with? Because I was watching the interview parts with Bob, that were cut, and I thought, oh my goodness,
yeah,
this is really rich information.
Yeah.
And I don't know how everyone else felt, but when I watched The Boys Who Said No, I had the similar feeling when I'm reading a novel where you're switching from point of view from each person in a chapter, for books that are like that.
Yeah.
Where you get invested in a particular character, and then the chapter ends and it's a different character. You're like, no, I want to find out about
I want to find out more about them. That's a really good point. It's we haven't really thought to do anything with the outtakes. I mean, obviously there are. Well, when we did our first rough cut screening, the film was 5 hours long. I think there was 4, something like that. So, I mean, if anybody wants to watch that rough cut, they're welcome to do that. I mean, I was thinking about George. Are you thinking of George? I've lost his last name. George, who writes about Scandinavia. When you said he was from Philadelphia.
George Lakey.
George Lakey, who's an amazing guy, and we did a wonderful interview with him, and he didn't make the cut. And I've been talking to him recently, and he sent me a donation. I said, "That's so nice of you." After we cut you out of the film, he said, "Oh, I've been in a lot of films that I wasn't in the film." He said, "I'm used to this. It's okay." But he was a fabulous interview, and I love what he said. And he's an amazing organizer and thinker, and so I mean, there are a lot of people like that who didn't make the cut, who are sitting on the edit room floor, and I'm sure people would enjoy hearing their stories too. So yes, that's another project. It could be a radio series, maybe. It might be worth just doing the interview parts and putting it in context on a radio series. I'll think about that.
That sounds like a good idea.
That's a good idea.
I'm glad to give you some ideas. Louise has a question for you. Thank you for your masterful film. Just curious, I wondered as I watched whether individuals with high draft numbers participated at the same rate in draft resistance. Did they also burn their cards?
Bob, do you know the answer to that?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
Did people who had high draft numbers and didn't have
Oh.
to respond, burn their draft cards as well, or I don't think, certainly not in the same numbers as people.
By the time they introduced the draft lottery numbers, the war was almost over. The bulk, in fact, virtually the entire footage of that film, I think, was before the lottery numbers even came into being. But there's no question that the lottery numbers kicked a lot of the fervor out of the anti-draft movement, because all of a sudden people saw. Before that, everybody was at risk. Well,
yeah.
Except for people with bone spurs and issues like that. But the fact was that everybody sort of felt at risk. I mean, you made decisions. Do I go for a graduate degree because that'll keep me out of the army and so on. Once the numbers came, you were in and out, and it took a lot of the I was going to say fear, but I don't think it was that. The moral questions weren't nearly as sharp anymore.
Yeah.
So I think I think it's unknown how many people with high numbers resisted on purpose. Some of us did. I could have had a conscientious objector deferment.
Yeah.
There were a bunch of us like that even before high numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you and another Quaker were both in prison, because you didn't need to be in prison. I mean, you could have gotten neutral conscientious status, which you would have spent 2 years in alternative service, but you chose prison just because you didn't want to cooperate with the. I'm just saying.
In fact, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. John and I, we both had been to North Vietnam with civilian aid. We both resisted the draft, and we both had conscientious objector status. We could have walked away.
Yeah.
Troublemakers, that's all.
Yeah, troublemakers. That's
good trouble. Good trouble. Good trouble.
I'm making a film right now that's about a woman who's a troublemaker, who was Julian Assange's accomplice on the collateral murder video that showed the killings in Iraq, on the street in Iraq, and which is why Julian is in prison now. And she was a member of parliament in Iceland, and I've been following her for 10 years, and now it's like this historical document of the history of the internet. She's a geek and a politician. She calls herself a poetician. She's a poet as well. Quite an amazing character, and almost became prime minister of Iceland. She won the election, but she didn't want to collaborate with the right wing and put a coalition together. So she gave up that job. And she's just an amazing troublemaker. I mean, she's just that's what she does. She's a disruptor. She goes around the world inspiring people to just, really stand up to illegitimate power. And she's quite inspiring. So I've been finally getting close to getting that done after 10 years. But it's been interesting because the way we were approaching the internet 10 years ago was like this utopian
very different
space, right? Where, we could actually, everyone, I mean, I've got John Perry Barlow was one of the characters early on. He's passed away now, but he really inspired people. I'm somewhere I can't get a glass of water. But anyway, it's I think that idea of people who are willing to be troublemakers and pay the price, which Virginia has. Sorry.
No worries, Judith. We've all been there. I wish I could hand you my water bottle from over here. Oh my goodness. Bob, so you've gone through a lot of transition. You've made a lot of very brave choices in your life. And you mentioned earlier, you don't regret any of them. Now, during the events that happened in this documentary, how did you feel your actions have informed who you've become today?
Well, I've done things that have been really painful, frankly. Prison for me was pretty painful. I learned an amazing amount of things, but it was at a cost. But the reason I have no regrets is because I figure all these different things in my life are sort of have I have an absolutely illogical belief that there's kind of a causality to the whole thing, and that there's a logic to it all, and it's going somewhere. And where it ended up at a certain point was meeting my wife and settling down and having 4 children. And if that's where it was all leading, I don't regret a thing. And if I hadn't done one of those painful things, I might never have met her and had 4 children. So that's a very bizarre sort of a causality picture. I want to say one thing. I was moved by an op-ed piece I read a couple of days ago about Hungary, because Hungary has been a little ambivalent about this, about the Ukrainian war. And I was reminded that I spent a couple of weeks in Hungarian prison in '68 when the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia. It was a Warsaw Pact invasion. It was sort of like, and so the various East European satellite countries took part in it. Hungary was one of them. And we had the War Resistance League had a simultaneous demonstrations, all the Warsaw Pact countries protesting it, just like we protested the war in Vietnam. And I picked Budapest. And that prison cell was interesting. It was right out of, you ever read Darkness at Noon? I got interviewed by a guy in a room, and it actually had padding on the walls. When I saw that, I said, oh my God. I was never tortured. I was just given bad cigarettes. But in that prison, in the cell, with a mat on the floor and a loaf of bread and a slab of jam and a cup of weak coffee, which lasted me, it was a big loaf of bread. And I got coffee replenished at the other 3 mealtimes. That was it. It was kind of Spartan. But on the door, which was a bimetallic door on the inside, people had scratched things. And there was a swastika. And under the swastika was the word Freiheit, freedom. Now, the Nazis occupied Hungary and got chased out. And obviously, I think this is some Nazi that got caught. And a German, because he used the word Freiheit, some German Nazi got caught and he got thrown in this cell. And all he could think of, this Nazi, was freedom. And I thought, what an unbelievable irony. And then down lower, Nagy, N-A-G-Y, was the leader of the resistance to the Soviets during the Hungarian uprising in '56. And there was Nagy's name. And once again, the word freedom. So anyway, I etched in with as best I could, a peace sign and the English word freedom. But the fascinating thing to me is this concept of freedom and how it's abused by that Nazi and so on, and how it's abused to send soldiers into war because you're fighting for freedom. Anyway, I'm sorry I'm off on that meandering,
No,
but
it's important. It's really important. And I think that one thing that there's so many complexities to this invasion of the Ukraine, but it feels to me like it's really raised people's consciousness of what democracy means. And, why would we support Ukraine and a democratic country there, and the sort of enthusiasm for that, even though there's lots of bone spurs involved, but it does feel like these questions of this sort of assumption that the world is going to become increasingly more democratic is clearly not the case. And, I think we need to really be working harder and harder to get people to decide if they want democracy, they're going to have to fight for it, because it's not going to
every
happen
time.
in the US, and it's not going to happen in the Ukraine, and it's, without people standing up for it. Hopefully we don't have to do it from bomb shelters, but I think, there is a lot of danger of the world going the other way, and the US. Having been out of the country for over 2 years, I'm going back in a couple of weeks, and I'm just sort of like bracing myself for what it feels like. It feels like it's a bit of a war zone at home too, politically. So I'm kind of, I follow it closely, but it's going to be interesting to see what it feels like having been away. But all those issues remain, and that was, that was a wonderful story about your time. How long were you in that prison?
10 days, I think it was. 10 days. They finally worked out that I wasn't a CIA agent. I was there with 4 other people, a West German, a Brit, and an Indian.
Wow.
So we were a multinational team, and they finally threw us out. Thank goodness.
It reminds me of, sorry.
Their system is such as on the first day of interrogation, this guy had very, very bad. German is the second language of Hungary. English is not. And the only interrogator that even spoke English was bad. He started it right out. My first interview with him, he says, "You're guilty, 20 years in prison. Now let's talk about your confession." But they started the sort of in a reverse direction. I'm so young and immortal. I think I'm immortal. I'm thinking, I don't think 20 years is enough to learn this stupid language. That was all I could think of. It's one of the most, that and Finnish are really strange languages.
Yeah. Oh, really strange. I can't even pronounce anyone's names. They're really bad. I was thinking Dan Ellsberg said when he was facing 115 years in prison that he was looking forward to it. He was going to learn to play the guitar. No, mandolin. Mandolin. Now, there's a positive attitude.
There's a positive attitude.
Oh, there's so many. Yeah, it reminded me, your story reminded me a little of a story we told in Good War, which was the 4, Dave Dellinger, now I'll forget the other people's names, but there are 4 men who were resistors who went to the, I'm going to get the story wrong. It's like they were crossing into East Berlin, which they weren't supposed to be. And they had a mimeograph machine on their backs and on bicycles, right? And they were translating into German and Polish. They had one of them, I think it was Dellinger, spoke like 6 languages, and he was able to translate their flyers into all these languages, which they would do every night, and then go right in and hand them out to the Russian troops and the German troops. And it's such an amazing story. They traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles on a bike with this mimeograph machine on their back, trying to get the word out to the soldiers who were on the east side of the.
And that march started in San Francisco, walked across the country, got on a boat, went to England, and then across Europe into East Europe, and then into Moscow finally. Yeah.
I don't think I knew that.
It wasn't the same people. Different people picked it up at different places and so on. But
But but these troublemakers are everywhere. Just to say, in a Hungarian prison and in a Russian prison in East Berlin, there's no stopping them.
Well, Judith and Bob, we are approaching our hour mark, and it's just been such a pleasure to listen to your stories, really, both of you. Judith, with your experience in putting documentaries together and just really shining a light on part of history that's very important and little known to many people who are especially younger today. In fact, I don't think many people knew much about the Vietnam War who didn't live through it. So it's just such an important aspect to look back at our history too. So thank you so much, Judith. And Bob, your experiences, my goodness. Your story so moved me in this documentary, from your tale about your father and the video you saw, and where your journey has taken you. And I agree with you. We all make choices in our lives, and we end up places, and we wouldn't be there without those choices. So
exactly.
Thankful for all of our choices that we make, whether we learn from them, or.
Thank you for inviting us, and Bob, thank you for joining us. I really enjoyed getting to spend the time with you again.
It's such a pleasure, such a pleasure. I want to give a quick shout out. Judith, you referred to this, that during World War II, it was kind of the Quakers, the Mennonite, and the Brethren, sort of the religious pacifists. Right now in Russia, there are men in prison for resisting the draft, and mostly they come from 2 religious groups, the Doukhobors, which is a strange group
Right.
that mainly immigrated out of Russia during the Tsar's time, thanks to a combination of Quaker and Tolstoy at the turn of the century got them out because they were refusing to serve because of their religious principles. And the other group is the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have refuse all things doing with nationhood. They consider it idolatry. So there are Jehovah's Witnesses and Doukhobors now in prison in Russia. And since Putin came to power, the repression on them is getting greater. I hope that Ukraine opens the eyes and a more non-sectarian group comes along, just as it did in the Vietnam War, to really expand that, because denying the state the power to send men into war is a wonderful, wonderful weapon.
Thank you, Bob. Oop, Judith, you are muted. So just so you know, I know you wanted to say something. Yes, you're on mute.
Thank you. I just, thanks for that, Bob, because I think there's a lot of people, there's a huge number of deserters in the Russian army. And there's also, I think, and there is a pacifist movement. And Amy Goodman had one of the leaders on the Democracy Now! Who's leader of the Ukrainian pacifist movement. But I think there is actually organizing going on both sides
Yeah.
and pacifists are trying to stop the war, and also resistors in Russia. Amazing times we're living through as usual, but it never stops.
Yes.
Go ahead, Kim, try to stop this. I think we're going to keep talking.
I know. well, I wanted to invite both of you, actually. I wanted to invite both of you because this is part of a one book initiative for our community. And the book that we are giving out for free to our community, it's called The Best We Could Do. It's a graphic novel, and it's written by a Vietnamese immigrant who now lives in the States, and it's about her family's journey. And man, I mean, it's an illustrated book, so a lot of it is full of imagery and just really hits home to me with my background. And so we are actually having an interview with her on April 5th. That's a Tuesday evening at 6:30 Eastern time, US Eastern time. But I extend an invitation to both of you to join us and listen in as we try to take a look at history again and see many different voices in our history during this time period. So I'm going to stop both of you now because I think you guys can go on forever, and I'll be, just completely engrossed and engaged and forget my time too. So thank you to you both again for joining us this evening. Judith, all the way from Australia, and Bob, you're from Maine right now, joining us from Maine.
Far reaches of Maine, Cundy's Harbor, Maine.
Yes, yes. So have a good evening, and good evening, everyone. I think everyone's thanking both of you for your time and your words of wisdom.
Thanks for the invitation, Kim.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Great.
Good
Take
night.
care. Good night. Bye, Bob. Bye, Bob. Good to see you.